Talk Ava. Learn English with confidence.
You can study English for years and still say something that sounds slightly off in a real conversation. The sentence may be understandable, but the way it is built makes it feel unnatural to the listener.
That usually happens with small words, not complex grammar. These are the mistakes that do not stop communication, but they do affect how natural you sound.
I noticed this clearly during a conversation I had a few days ago. It started as a normal discussion, but a small sentence changed how I saw this topic.
What kind of conversation was it?
I was talking to a colleague about a project update. He was explaining something that another person had said earlier, and I wanted to respond quickly.
So you were focused more on the idea than the structure?
Yes, and that is when I said, he said me that the plan will change. At that moment, I did not think it was wrong.
The meaning is clear, so it feels acceptable.
That is what I thought, but he paused for a moment and then said, "You mean he told you that the plan will change?"
That correction is small, but it changes the sentence completely.
Yes, and the interesting part is that I understood both forms. I knew say and tell, but I had not fully understood how they work inside a sentence.
That is a very common situation. Many learners know the vocabulary, but the structure is not clear.
The conversation continued, and I tried to explain something else. I said, "He said me the details yesterday." And again, it felt normal while speaking.
And I assume the correction happened again.
Yes, he responded, "He told you the details yesterday." And this time I noticed the pattern more clearly.
So the same mistake repeated in a slightly different sentence.
Exactly, and that is what made me stop and think. It was not a one-time mistake. It was a pattern I was using without realizing it. That is important because repeated patterns are harder to fix than single mistakes. After that, I asked him directly, why does "say me" sound wrong, but "tell me" sounds correct? I wanted to understand it clearly.
And what did he say?
He explained it simply. He said, "You usually say something, but you tell someone." That sentence stayed in my mind. That explanation is short, but it points to something deeper. Yes, because when I thought about it, I realized I had been focusing only on meaning, not on how the sentence is built. And that is where the confusion. Yes, because I placed a person directly after say without using to, which made the sentence feel incorrect.
And when you changed it to "he told me that the plan will change," the structure became correct immediately.
That made the difference very clear. It was not about memorizing rules, it was about noticing where the person appears in the sentence.
Another moment where this became clear is when you asked, "What did he say?" That sentence worked perfectly because there was no person after the verb.
Yes, and when I answered, "He said that the timeline will change," it also followed the same pattern.
So within one conversation, you moved between say and tell naturally, based on structure.
That is what made this topic easier to understand. Instead of thinking about definitions, I started looking at patterns.
And once you see the pattern, you do not need to stop and think every time. The sentence starts forming naturally.
Another example came up during that same discussion. I said, "He told me to check the report," and that sentence felt completely natural.
That works because instructions usually follow the "tell someone to do something" pattern.
Then I tried to say it differently. I said, "He said to check the report," and it felt incomplete.
That is because say does not usually work in that structure without additional words. You would need to say, "He said that I should check the report."
That made the difference even clearer. Some sentence types naturally belong to tell, especially when you are giving instructions.
So now the pattern becomes stronger. Tell is used when there is a person and often when giving instructions, while say is used for reporting the message.
By the end of that conversation, I was not thinking about say or tell anymore. I was just checking the structure quickly in my head.
And that is the goal. You do not want to memorize rules, you want to recognize patterns while speaking. That will help you use these patterns more confidently without stopping in the middle of your sentence.
That same conversation actually continued the next day, and this time I was more aware of what I was saying. We were discussing feedback from a client, and I had to explain what they communicated. That is a good situation to test this because it naturally requires both say and tell in different ways.
I started by saying, the client said that they are not satisfied with the current design. This sentence felt clear and natural.
That works because you are reporting the message and there is no person directly after said.
Then I added, they told us to make some changes before the next meeting, and that also felt correct without hesitation.
That sentence fits the tell someone to do something pattern, which is very common in.
And that clarity comes from understanding the structure, not from memorizing corrections. That will help you make this pattern automatic, even when you are speaking quickly. After those conversations, I started testing this idea more deliberately in my own speaking. Instead of thinking about rules, I focused on building sentences and checking the structure as I spoke.
That is a good approach because it turns passive understanding into active use. When you apply it in real situations, the pattern becomes stronger.
For example, I was explaining the same project to another colleague, and I said, the client said that they are not ready to approve the design. That sentence came naturally.
That works because you are reporting the message, and there is no person directly after said.
Then I continued, they told us to prepare a new version before the next meeting. And again, there was no hesitation.
That follows the pattern of giving instructions, where tell connects directly to the people receiving the information.
What I noticed was that I no longer needed to stop and think about say or tell. I just checked what comes after the verb.
That is the key shift. You are no longer translating or guessing. You are recognizing the structure automatically.
I also started correcting myself faster when something felt wrong. At one point, I almost said, they said us to wait, but I stopped before finishing the sentence. That shows your awareness is improving because you are catching the mistake before it becomes complete. I corrected it to, they told us to wait, and the sentence immediately felt natural. This is how your speaking improves over time. The pause becomes shorter, and eventually it disappears. I also tried explaining this idea to a friend. I said, if there is a person after the verb, use tell. If you are focusing on the message, use say. That is a simple way to remember it, and it works in most situations.
Then I gave him an example. I said, you can say, he said something important, but you should say, he told me something important.
That kind of comparison makes the difference very clear. We also looked at one more example. I said, you can say, she said that she will call later, but you should say, she told me that she will call later. Again, the difference depends on whether a person is included in the structure. By the end of that discussion, he was also able to use both forms correctly without thinking too much. That shows how effective a clear pattern can be. Once you understand it, you can apply it immediately. Now, if I think back to the first mistake I made, it feels very obvious.